Four American missionaries had been murdered. Dorothy Kazel and Jean Donovan drove to the airport to pick up Ita Ford and Maura Clark, who were returning to El Salvador from a religious conference in Nicaragua. The women were stopped and taken to a remote place where they were questioned by military men of the National Guard. Their bodies show evidence of rape and torture. Peasants in the area heard the shots that killed the missionaries. Officers of the National Guard were responsible for the deed. The four missionaries were in the country, working on various religious activities and supporting humanitarian help programs for the civilian victims of the armed conflict. Maura Clark was born on January 13, 1931 in New York. Maura belonged to the congregation of the Maryknoll Sisters. She arrived in El Salvador in August 1980. Ita Ford was born on April 23, 1940. She grew up in Brooklyn, New York. She also belonged to the Maryknoll congregation. She arrived in El Salvador on April 13, 1980. Jean Donovan was born on April 1, 1953 in Connecticut. At age 27, she is the youngest of the four murdered missionaries. Jean used to work in youth ministry in the Cleveland diocese. When she heard about the mission the diocese had in El Salvador, she decided to join. She arrived in El Salvador in July 1979. Dorothy Kazel was born on June 30, 1939 in Cleveland, Ohio. When she was young, she attended parish schools in her neighborhood. She constantly showed her desire to teach others. After her high school graduation, she was able to complete an intensive program to obtain a teaching certificate, accomplishing one of her dreams. Having worked as a third-grade teacher, Dorothy Kazel started to consider a religious vocation. It's in September 1960, after a lot of praying and thinking, she made the decision of joining the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland.
First of all, by visiting with the Indian reservation, gave her some thought about helping other people in the world. And this, to me, I think, was a calling to where she had in the back of her mind that she might want to do, either doing it through religious life or maybe just as a professional person.
She had been engaged and decided that there must be something more she should be doing with her life in a religious sense. And so she came to the convent, and I think at that time, she was searching. She was a person who was always searching to know God's will. I think she had a deep desire to do that.
After taking her first vows in 1963, Dorothy studied at Ursuline College in Cleveland, where she obtained her Bachelor's of Arts degree in literature. She also had certificates that accredited her as a social studies and typing teacher. For that reason, she was sent to teach different courses at Sacred Heart Academy. Meanwhile, in 1966, the Ursuline Sisters of Cleveland had decided to send two sisters to help develop the diocese mission in El Salvador for a 5-year term. Dorothy was one of the first to volunteer. In a letter dated November 4, 1967, she expressed her desire to help people. I've always been a restless person in search of going to new places, meeting new people, of learning, of understanding people, of helping. I registered in a Latin American course, and since then I wanted to go there more and more. These countries and their people attract me in a very special way. Dorothy's application was rejected because she hadn't taken perpetual vows. It is in 1968 that Dorothy professed her last vows as an Ursuline Sister of Cleveland. She was a counselor of young people for 2 years. She also volunteered in a hospital for chronic patients and at a correctional institution for women. It wasn't until 1974 when the Ursuline sisters had to appoint more sisters to the El Salvador mission. Dorothy was chosen as well as Martha Owen. Dorothy was chosen to go with the mission, something she had been waiting for many years.
I think her commitment to the poor, even when she was working as a high school teacher in Cleveland, her concern was always for the child or the teenager who had trouble or who needed some extra help or that sort of thing. And so her concern for the poor extended to the poor of the world, and her placement of actual response was then in El Salvador.
El Salvador continues in a convulsive situation. The socioeconomic conditions lead the country to levels of extreme poverty and injustice for the poor and the landless. Facing popular demands for better living conditions, the government answers with repression. New popular movements rise. They see the armed wing as the solution to the problem. Repressions, disappearances, kidnapping, torture and assassinations become the daily experience for Salvadorians. In the middle of all this struggle, there are cases of serious violations to civilian human rights. Dorothy arrived in La Unión in 1974, a town on the banks of the Gulf of Fonseca in the eastern side of the country, a place distant from the upheavals of San Salvador. She devoted herself to her pastoral work and the ministry group, including the planning and organizing of First Communion. They offered preparation for the sacraments and training for catechists, helping in this way in the forming of Christian communities. They also organized the distribution of food and charitable provisions.
Y caminaban cerca de 4 horas a pie. Ahí iban con sus
And they
pantalones,
went
con sus
walking
gorras.
for 4
Y ahí
hours.
iban para arriba.
They were untiring
mujeres
women,
incansables.
devoted people
O sea,
who came to
gente
work,
que vino a trabajar,
people who
gente
came
que
to
se vino a
give,
entregar,
and they gave us
gente que se vino a
motivation
dar.
to serve in the
Y
same
nos dio
way.
el motivo de esa entrega, la fuerza de esa entrega.
I think she had a very strong one. I was always impressed, especially in El Salvador, when we would come home after a day where we were all sweaty and dusty, and we'd kind of cool down with a shower, and then she would pull out her Bible and curl up in a chair with a nice cup of coffee and go through the Bible and study it. And I think her relationship with God was one that was always searching through trying to know God's will through reading the Bible.
In her visits to the communities, Dorothy lives with the people and finds out the levels of poverty in which most of the peasants and fishermen live.
Vieron que había mucha pobreza en la Unión, mucha.
They saw there was a lot of poverty in La Unión, too much poverty. They began giving agriculture a push forward. They trained people to be secretaries and priests because there was a scarcity of priests in La Unión.
Porque la Unión escaseaba de sacerdotes.
They had a peasant educational center for the people named Castaño, and we sent our people from Gotera to this center too. This center began to become suspicious, and the Chirilagua team was beginning to be threatened, and so were we, because we were teaching there.
Y nosotros también que estamos dando clases allá.
Together with the other congregation members, they get to strengthen and make the church grow. A church that had been almost completely abandoned up to this moment.
Porque al principio, especialmente en los primeros años, había
In the area during the first years, there was a lot of enthusiasm, many possibilities before violence began. There were many peaceful movements of students, syndicate, and others. We thought it was possible to make many changes, promotion of human rights and education. Back then, she was enthusiastic about all that.
Educación y entonces ella tenía un entusiasmo para todo eso.
However, Dorothy felt she could give and do more for this country and these people. She decides to get transferred to the Immaculate Conception Parish in the port of La Libertad, a central area of the country where there were higher levels of social violence and therefore greater needs. Dorothy felt that she could help. The beginning of the Civil War caused alarming levels of social violence. Popular organizations and their armed wing increased protest measures. Repressive tactics were adopted by the Salvadorian government and the Salvadorian army due to their inability to solve social problems. This only caused the sinking of the country into chaos and uncertainty. The church, together with its shepherd, Archbishop Arnulfo Romero, denounces the abuse and injustice many innocent Salvadorians are submitted to. He accompanies his people practicing a more active gospel. The church is the only choice of hope and faith for these suffering people. In this situation, the church is perceived as offering basis to subversion. Therefore, it is persecuted. Collaborators, Catholics, and priests are persecuted and assassinated. Dorothy arrives in La Libertad in 1977. The tense situation in the country is now undergoing demands for a more devoted religious work. Fear invades the community and many of the religious activities are carried out in the presence of military personnel.
Ella rezaba y ella decía, estamos siempre agradeciendo a Dios por las
She used to
cosas
pray.
buenas.
She used to say we're always thanking God for the good things, and we should keep a positive spirit with the people during persecution and death.
Este espíritu de agradecimiento.
And as usual, she showed so much joy, didn't she? She used to go running, skipping, like a little girl holding her skirt this way, and she said, I love to see the fields. I like nature. And you? Why are you so serious? Don't you like nature? So we said, yes, we do. We like it very much. It's very beautiful. And I hope ants bite you so you jump. It was really nice being with her. She was a person filled with spirit because she moved easily.
She helped us learn how to talk to people since we were beginners. She taught us how to address the people.
When children saw her coming, they left the classroom where we were teaching catechism and ran to hug her, and she hugged and kissed them all. She was always happy and loved all the children from here, from El Salvador. I remember and laugh now when she said the Bibles she took were for sale. They were 16 colones each and were given to everyone who wanted to have one. They were to be paid in installments. Many didn't even pay for them. But for her, it was important that people had the gospel. I remember that Sister Dorothy laughed and said, "It's not important if they didn't pay, but now they have the gospel."
During the war, we had difficult trials because of our faith, because of our personal job. I think the army thought it was a crime when we went out to teach about God.
And now we shouldn't leave a gap. We have to pick up all the richness she left behind. Her joy, her work, her dynamism of setting up crochet workshop, and many of the charitable things she did. Her work had no boundaries, and ours should be like hers.
Trabajar en Cáritas. Yo pienso que era sin fronteras, pues su trabajo. Pues así tiene que ser el de nosotros.
They came to El Salvador to promote the church with its mission. We were lucky to have this missionary priest as well as the nuns. They came to teach us many things. Sometimes I used to say they were angels of God because they didn't tell anyone apart. They hugged everyone with so much tenderness. That made an impression on me. It is here in La Libertad where she meets Jean Donovan, and together they shared a friendship that will lead them to carry out the religious work more intensely. Everyone knew about them. You could see them go in their white van to the most remote places, inaccessible to others.
Las hermanas estaban trabajando siempre en la formación de el liderazgo de la parroquia.
The sisters were working on forming leadership in the parish. They worked in the milk program sponsored by Caritas, preparing and organizing the people. They also trained catechists for First Communion and things of this sort. They were always working with the people more than we did. We worked more with the sacraments. They worked with the people day after day.
Trabajamos más con los sacramentos, ellos trabajaron con la gente día tras día.
Eran mujeres de fe.
They were women of faith, of prayer. Dorothy especially was a woman, I wouldn't say mystic, or maybe I would, a woman of intensive prayer and profound faith. You could see this in her behavior, the way she talked, the way she acted. I saw that in her, a complete nun, a woman of God.
Despite the fact that her time in mission in El Salvador had finished, Dorothy decided to stay with the people. She stated so in a letter to a friend. "We talked a lot about what might happen if something starts. Most of us would like to stay here. We don't want to abandon the people. I thought I should tell you how I feel. Keep it in your heart. If the day comes when others have to understand, please explain it to them for me."
Ella pidió permiso de su congregación para seguir.
She asked permission from her congregation to continue working here so she wouldn't have to leave the friends she had made. She obtained permission to stay 2 more years. We talked a lot about whether it was good to stay or if it was better to leave. We met to pray many times, and we also met to discuss together, Maryknoll sisters and the team of Cleveland, and we finally decided we wanted to stay.
Y siempre al final decidimos vamos a quedar. Queremos quedar.
Y siempre buscando la base espiritual.
Looking for a spiritual base in everything we did, we became social workers, warriors, and always pastoral agents. The base of all our work was the life of prayer we had.
Ayudar a la gente. Siempre la base de esta es la vida de oración que tuvimos.
Despite all the hardships and problems they faced, they lived happily, which is the only way to live. A Christian cannot live sadly, gloomy or oppressed, but full of joy and happiness.
Sino que hay que vivir siempre con alegría y con gozo.
"1980 becomes an extremely agitated year in politics and military life. March 24, an unprecedented event that had never been seen and that would touch all the national and international communities, occurred. The Archbishop of San Salvador was murdered by the death squads. After the killing of Archbishop Romero, Jean and Dorothy were present when there were deaths among those who were at the wake in San Salvador's cathedral. There was an attack with bombs and gunfire, resulting in panic, where 44 died and hundreds were injured. Archbishop Romero had been murdered, and now anything could happen to church members, since they were accused of participating in subversive actions and of organizing the guerrillas. Christ asked us not to be afraid of persecution, because, beloved brothers and sisters, those who get engaged with the poor have to run the same destiny of the poor, to disappear, to be tortured, to become murder victims. The prevailing situation is characterized for being totally contrary to the values of gospel. It is what Medellin calls institutional violence, violence that hits the church too. It doesn't respect fundamental rules or institutional rights. In the last few months of 1980, the work of the Cleveland team included transportation of people and goods to refugee centers for victims of the Civil War, which was getting worse. Dorothy and Jean traveled frequently to Chalatenango, where they helped Maryknoll's sisters, Maura Clark and Ita Ford, to transport refugees. The last few days of November 1980, several nuns from El Salvador traveled to Nicaragua to participate in a meeting of the Maryknoll congregation. Maura Clark and Ita Ford couldn't get airplane tickets to come back on the same flight as the others. That's why Dorothy and Jean offered to drive twice to the airport.
Decimos a ellos que no tenían que volver.
We told them that they didn't have to drive back to the airport to pick up Ita and Maura because they said they could take a taxi. However, they said that they were going back. As we said goodbye, I always remember her smile saying, "We're going back to pick up Maura and Ita."
Diciendo esto, vamos a volver a buscar a Maura y Ita.
On their way back from the airport, they were intercepted by military men of the National Guard in civilian clothes. They were taken to San Pedro Nonualco, a town 1 hour away from the airport and in an opposite direction from La Libertad. Peasants in the area watched the car pass, and minutes later they heard the shooting. The 4 nuns had been raped and murdered. They were executed. The 4 women had put a lot of their energy in pastoral work and had also accompanied the victims of violence. These activities were described as political activism and their cause of death. The time they lived in El Salvador led them to face a fundamental challenge of faith. In a world torn by injustice and violence against the poorest and the most vulnerable.
Sentíamos un enorme apoyo.
We had great support with them. I especially felt that way. We saw in Sister Dorothy, as well as in the other nuns, an extra lung to breathe that suffocating environment. In other words, we saw them as a refuge, a protection, a shelter.
Como una protección, como un refugio. Tener a estas personas entre nosotros.
She made the choice of staying with the people. That was her greatest desire. Although she had worried about her family, about her parents, about her brother. However, she wanted to be here in El Salvador. This is the one thing I was able to notice about her commitment. Dorothy was where she wanted to be. I'm convinced that she wouldn't have wanted to leave the country to live somewhere else, although she knew she would risk her life. No, she was in the place she wanted to be. As people say, if the grain doesn't die, it doesn't give fruit. The day she died, everyone grew stronger. We figured that if a person comes from the United States, a place where you have all the comforts and everything, and dies because of us, it is not possible. And we, being from this place, are afraid to die, it's not possible. This is what made me think that people from other countries give their lives in this place. It should be us. We should take that cross and serve others.
As the word of our Lord says, some plant but others harvest. The harvest of what she planted here is being received by the other brothers we are preaching the gospel to. I think they were special souls. I think that having them among us was a gift of God. I remember her very well, small, very active, very dedicated, very devoted to people.
Y muy activa, muy dedicada, muy entregada a la gente.
A few days before she was murdered, Dorothy wrote a letter to the Diocese of Cleveland. If we look at this small country, El Salvador as a whole, we'll discover that it is a country writhing in pain, a country that faces the loss of a lot of people daily, but at the same time, it is a country that waits and hopes for peace. The unbreakable faith and courage of our leaders in preaching the gospel, although it might mean losing their lives, is always something to admire. Her death means blood, cross, and it also means love, joy, and perfume. Her memories revive the best emotions, the best feelings, the best attitudes, and the best decisions of those who allow themselves to be inspired by her testimony.